I've long said that leaders must be learners. Today, we're taking another step beyond that to reinvention. How do you reinvent yourself as a leader? Welcome to episode 131 of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. That's why you came. Our guest today is John Hillen. We're going to talk to him after I tell you about him. Dr. John Hillen is a leadership and strategy professor in the School of Business at George Mason University, a consultant, and a director of many companies. His views on leadership draw from his experience, get this, as a CEO of public and private companies, as a board chair and director, as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, a former U.S. Army officer, and a decorated combat leader. He holds degrees from Duke and King's College in London, received his MBA from Cornell, and his doctorate from Oxford. I'm not sure I'm in the same, I can even hold up a conversation with John. He regularly writes on leadership and strategy, both of which he teaches at George Mason's MBA program. He's recently recognized as one of the 100 most influential business leaders in Washington, D.C., and has co-authored the book, What Happens Now? Reinvent Yourself as a Leader Before Your Business Outruns You. And if you're watching, you can see the book here. And if you're listening, you can see it all, learn all about it in the show notes. What Happens Now? John, welcome.
Kevin, how are you?
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. I'm good this morning and all as well. And we determined before I turned the recording on that yesterday we were within a few, probably 100 yards of each other at the Dulles airport. But now he's in his office, I think, and I'm in mine. And we're going to chat a little bit about leadership and what happens next, what happens now. So, John, just from that brief bio, it's pretty clear that you've had an interesting journey to get to this point. So tell us all a little bit about your leadership journey.
Yeah, well, leadership's been the sort of theme of my life, and not much else holds it together because I've bounced around and had sort of 3 or 4 different careers before I was 50. But I had a mentor who I mentioned in the acknowledgments in the book, a business leader who once encouraged me to go into a business I knew nothing about. And I said, well, I know nothing about that business. And he said, every enterprise in the world, whether it's a small church choir or IBM, has only one thing in common, and that they're both, and everyone in between is full of people working together trying to accomplish something. And he said, that's the only thing you need to know. All the other details about the business or the enterprise are just X's and O's. He said, if you can be an expert in the dynamic of helping people work together to accomplish something, you're in any business you want to be in. And
that's the way harder part, right?
Yeah. Right.
And that's the way harder part.
Yeah, it's much harder. I mean, you can pick up the playbook and learn whatever game you're in. I started my career in financial services and knew nothing about it. And I had to learn, I had to get licensed up on Wall Street and all that. And then I switched to a totally different industry a couple of years later. But actually, yeah, you can learn the X's and O's of any enterprise, nonprofit, government agency, business, corporation, global. But pulling people together and trying to get something accomplished through others and keep them all on track turns out to be not only the much harder piece, but the consistent theme that every organization has in common.
We could even have I think a really fruitful conversation for folks listening who maybe have changed industries or are thinking about changing industries. And I would say that, you bring tremendous value coming in with a fresh set of eyes, because not only do now I have to learn financial services, but I can bring what I know about other businesses in and provide a perspective that the financial services people don't see because all they know is financial services, right? So you're actually providing another value you're not even thinking about if you're making that shift. And I think that's one of the things that we as consultants, hopefully good ones, can bring to the table, is that perspective.
Absolutely.
So other than having a mentor that said it's really about leadership and not managing a business, my way of saying what he said. So what would be a couple of key things you learned, because let me back up and say that I've said on this podcast before that my goal is to have leadership experts, which you are, and expert leaders, experienced leaders, which you are. And so leaving on the leader hat before we sort of shift to the author consultant hat, what are a couple of things that you learned doing it that maybe you would find useful to share with others?
Oh gosh, I think the hardest thing is, and thus, the book that I wrote with, my friend Mark Nevins is this idea that you have to be a different kind of leader at different kind of stages. So unlike somebody playing a sport or something, you can't get into a certain rhythm where you just say, oh, I shoot a 20-foot jump shot and that's my thing. And I just have to bounce around the court until I get a 20-foot jump shot because that's my thing. And like the great, I'm using a basketball analogy here, like the great basketball players through time, they changed their game as the people around them and their talents changed, as the mission and composition of the organization and the team changed, as their own skills changed and they developed in their own mind. So all leaders are constantly on a journey, hopefully a journey of self-discovery where they're part of it. But even if they're not trying to self-discover themselves, they're being changed as they grow. Everybody does. And to change your skill set, your approach, your mindset, and your behaviors turns out to be the hardest thing. So for instance, when I was growing my last company, including taking it public in the middle of a recession and doing a bunch of acquisitions and other things, I needed to constantly shift where I spent my time and energy, on whom I was focused, which constituents I was trying to manage, how I told the story, how I told it to certain audiences, and what I needed to grab and refuse to let go, and what I needed to completely let go, even if it was going to result in some family crystal being broken potentially. And that combination of learning your new moves on the court, because you're always bringing in new players and you're trying to play as a team, I think is the most difficult part of leadership, and the evergreen nature of it, the constant need to reassess this reality around you as a leader and reflect on yourself turns out to be really, really difficult for leaders. They love to get into a groove, into a rhythm, and then just say, hey, this is my thing, I'm going to run with it.
It's so it's serendipitous, I think, that you started with a basketball analogy, in part because I'm a basketball fan. But the other thing is, just in the last 24 hours, I've been reading about and listening to, watching a little bit more about Wilt Chamberlain. And I'm coming to the conclusion that, quite honestly, Wilt may have been the greatest basketball player ever. And most people would put him on the list. But here's the thing. Early in his career, I mean, one year he averaged 50 points a game.
Right.
And a different time in his career, he led the league in assists.
Right.
And he was 7 feet tall. So the point that I'm making here is, I don't want everyone to get lost in the basketball analogy, but Wilt, literally did that. He literally became a different player.
Yeah.
Because of coaching and because of choice. And so, I don't think we have very many examples of that in basketball at that level. And it's exactly what you just talked about realizing what I need to do and what I need to do to help my team be successful. It's just really a phenomenally important thing. And I think that's really, shockingly, what your book is about, right? It's about how do I figure that out? And you introduce an idea in the very beginning of the book that you call sophisticated leadership. And
right.
Everyone, me included, who writes books about leadership tries to come up with language that is ours and that is meaningful. And I've not heard that stated that way. So I'd like you to, and it was really useful and helpful to me. So can you talk to us all about what sophisticated leadership means, or what you mean by that phrase?
Yeah. So, when Mark and I started writing this book, we've worked with, between the two of us, we've worked with or led or consulted with or been on the boards of or helped hundreds of different kinds of enterprises, from small NGOs to huge global multinational corporations and everything in between. We decided to write a book about scaling. What's it like when you're trying to grow or change an organization? Because it turns out about 100% of the enterprises I've ever worked with are trying to grow or change themselves. I've almost never stepped into a situation where somebody's like, we want everything to stay exactly the same. Right. It just doesn't happen.
And by the way, if that's really what you needed, like if the world was perfect, we don't even need leaders then.
Right. Yeah. A couple of people manage, look at the playbook,
Exactly.
do what it says on page 37, and off you go. So 100% of organizations are trying to grow or change, but only about 5% or less make parallel plans to grow or change their leaders along with their business plan for their organization. They recognize intuitively that it's a different game when you get to the next level, but they don't put into practice or place the plans to say, therefore I need to be a different coach or player or leader at the next level. And so the book is about scaling. And when we looked at when organizations grow or change and the kind of challenges leaders are confronted with, for us, they fell into two categories. One is just more of the same, more stuff. I've got more customers, more vendors, more suppliers, more locations, more employees, more payroll, more product, more service lines, more. And we have equipped managers and leaders in the business community with an amazing array of tools to handle the more of the same. We have all these management trends and fads. We have big data analysis. We have artificial intelligence coming online. We have analytics. We have all these decision-making tools. We can restructure. We can reorganize. And because of that, most leaders try to engineer their way through the challenges of more.
Yeah.
But what we found really trips up leaders is not that stuff. But what trips up leaders is not more complexity, but more sophistication. And more sophistication are challenges that are not more the same. They're different. They're new, different, not new, more. And so you have totally different kinds of customers that require completely different approaches and different behaviors. You have different kinds of employees. You have different kinds of stakeholders. You have a different kind of partner and vendor and supply chain. And everything about how you approach them needs to change, most especially the mindset, behavior, and skills of the leaders involved. And so we thought, let's just try to separate your world of things confronting you into these buckets of challenges of complexity that I can engineer through and challenges of sophistication where I need to change my behavior as a leader to get through.
And you used a word a minute ago that as I was reflecting and as I was listening to you, you said something about the mindset of the leader. And I think that is in large part what this book helps us think about. And my very quick reflection, I was telling you before we started that you're the 127th. I think if you're listening, if the order gets changed between now and when, but as of this moment, the 127th person that I've had this conversation with for this podcast. And if I were to say, what's one of the commonalities of the people that I invite or choose to have here,
right.
And I don't know that I've ever thought about it quite until just this moment, is that mindset. People that come here and we have a conversation that ultimately comes down to mindset we talk a lot about skills and behaviors here. And I know you've listened to some, and so you're nodding your head, but I think mindset is it's clearly a big part of what I think about when I think about what it means to be a successful leader and figuring out what those need to be. And I think that's what this book is about. And so that just sort of struck me as you were talking. So thank you for helping me self-reflect for thousands of people. Okay, whatever.
In fact, they asked me, this is like an intervention, Kevin. They asked me to talk to you today about your own leadership growth.
Well, listen, I don't think I could do, if I were doing these podcasts and not getting better, then I shouldn't be doing them.
Right.
Like I had this tremendous opportunity. Everyone who's listening has much the same opportunity, except that I get the chance to engage in the conversation. Everyone else that's listening or watching can only, I like to think about these as being conversation where the listener is sort of sitting with us, but they can't actually engage. I get the chance to engage and ask it.
Yeah.
And have interventions, I guess.
You brought up one of the key points. You yourself already have a mechanism to turn the lens in on yourself and help chart and track your own growth journey as a leader, as a learner, as a student of self-discovery. And we found that's the very first tool with leaders is develop a mechanism. Sometimes it's a coach. Sometimes we have a lot of exercises and other tools in the book to help people, which is to say, how do I step back from myself kind of dispassionately and look at myself in the situation and say, oh, stuff's changed. I better change to be more effective. And so just to have that kind of self-awareness is really the first step.
I'm so blessed because so much of my work, if I choose to do this, which I think I choose to do, gives me the chance to do that. Last 2 days, teaching a workshop with a group of leaders. Today, having this conversation with you, almost every day writing something. I tell people all the time that all the length of time that I've been blogging, which is a very long time and a whole lot of stuff, would have been worth every minute of it if no one ever read it. Now,
right.
I wouldn't keep doing it if someone wasn't reading it. I'm just being honest. But the value that I get from the introspection and the thinking about it is incredibly. And I'm sure you'd say the same thing about the book, right?
Yeah,
if no one read
that's one of the reasons why I went to go teach after I sold my last company. Is you ascend to a higher level of self-awareness if you teach or write about something, and absent that, you have to really push yourself. And I think this is the challenge for leaders who are in the chair driving things every day. How do you push yourself to put time on your calendar? We call it the third space in the book, to have this reflection, this self-awareness.
So that was one of the things I want to talk about. So I want to get back to the book, and let's talk about the third space just for a second. And then I want to talk a little bit more. And we're by everyone, if you come in late or you missed it, we're talking about the book, which written by Dr. John Hillen and his co-author, Mark Nevins, called What Happens Now. So tell us about the third space.
Yeah, so the third space is a concept. We have these 7 stalls in the book. And one of the stalls is when you stall because you're spending your time and energy in the wrong places. I don't know about you and your work, but I've never yet met a leader who won't answer yes to the question of, do you feel like you're captive to your email inbox? And do you feel like you're only putting out fires? Oh my gosh, yes, that's my life. How did you know? I said, because every leader has that life. And so we try to give leaders a couple of tools to say, actually, as your organization grows and changes, you need to find a method that works for you to be able to pull back and ruthlessly decide where you're going to spend your own time and energy. And we offer a couple of tools, everything from President Eisenhower's old urgent importance matrix, which kind of was repopularized by Stephen Covey some 30 odd years ago. We add on some ways to think through where's your energy high and where's your energy low. And then also a real system for delegating in a very, very deliberate manner, but at the same time, not delegating only the things you can do. And one of the ways to figure this out is, how do I figure out where the best investment of my time and energy, both, limited qualities of things. I mean, you only have so much. Where's the best investment of that? Is a concept called the third space, which my co-author, Dr. Mark Nevins, drew from kind of urban planning, which is, we talk a lot about work-life balance. This is neither work nor your life. This is a third space just for you to reflect and think in a deliberate and organized way about how you spend your time and energy.
About both.
Yeah.
In life.
Yeah. And we have a great story about a woman named Tara Owens, an executive at a company called NetScout, who was driving back from a difficult meeting to a difficult offsite with lots of business questions and decisions. And she's thinking about all that, and she's going to make calls the whole drive about it. And then she hit this big dead patch in Kansas, for about an hour of no cell coverage. And that forced her into the third space. And her mind went less to the business issues at hand and more to, what should I do? What's my role? What's the most effective use of my things? Why is my head here and not there? And that was really, real revelation for her to have that. And she came out of that cell phone dead space, blessing the cell phone dead space, something we usually curse in our lives. And so, developing that time on your schedule, keeping it sacred, figuring out a way that worked for you. For me, it's in the pool. I'm a swimmer. And when I swim, I kind of meditate on, what am I trying to get done? What am I doing? It's not a to-do list. It's an assessment of my leadership time and energy and where is it best spent.
It's called, everybody, thinking is what it's called, instead of doing. And, it's interesting. You and I talked about airplanes before I hit record. And the worst thing that's happened in air travel for Kevin in the last 10 years is not smaller seats and paying for your bags. The worst thing that's happened from my perspective is Wi-Fi.
Wi-Fi, yeah. Your reading's probably chopped in half.
Now I don't turn it on. I almost never turn it on, but I know it's there. And I could do all that stuff. But see, I used to use airplane time as one of those times. I was either, using your language, third spacing, or I was reading,
Right.
which is can be pretty close to that, depending on what you're reading. And so, man, I tell you what, everyone now, they have no excuse not to be plugged in, and man, we need to figure it out in so many ways, not just about the technology piece, although it's a great story. We need to figure that out. So in the book you talk about, and you hinted at it because you're a good author guest, that there are 7 stalls. So real quickly, tell us about the 7, then I'm going to ask you about one of them. Okay.
Sure. So I'll tell you about the 7 stalls, then I'll wind it back to this point about, it's called thinking. So we found these 7 stalls that leaders predictably go through. And I should say up front is you should stall. This does not make you a bad person or ill-equipped to handle a leadership life.
Haven't failed, right?
If you stall. It doesn't matter what your personality is. It doesn't matter what your leadership style is, your action logic, whatever framework you want to use. Everybody stalls, and you should. Because you've been a victim of your own success. You stalled because the circumstances changed and you wanted them to change. You forced them to change, but now everything's different and you tend to stall. So our first stall is a stall in purpose, which is amazingly frequent. And we find leaders from the heads of huge multinational institutions down to startups struggling at points in the evolution of the organization. We're like, nobody gets us anymore. Nobody gets me. Nobody understands what we're trying to do. And so we have a very, practical set of frameworks for lighting and carrying the torch and recovering your ability to tell narrative guidelines, storytelling in some ways that give people purpose, identity, mission, vision, focus, strategy, and can be the boss when you're not around. So that's a very potent stall. We have a stall in teams. Almost every organization goes through them where teams start falling apart, and that the teams most likely to stall as teams are actually the teams full of all-star individuals. I found this when I recruited, when I was a public company CEO, and I recruited a team of high-level C execs, all of whom could have been CEOs in their own right. And I thought, well, gosh, I'm paying these people so much. They're so accomplished. They're absolutely terrific. They'll just self-manage, right? And so my policy was benign neglect for that team. And they weren't a good team. And I failed them by failing to manage them. So we have a lot to say about a stall in teams. We have a stall in managing stakeholders. A lot of leaders tend to manage because of proximity, because of comfort. And the old joke, they look for their keys under the street light because that's where the light is. Mm-hmm. When in fact, as your organization grows and changes, you need to manage up and out. Stakeholders that don't work for you, but that could influence your destiny. Most leaders tend to be more comfortable managing stakeholders that work for them because it's easier to talk to somebody who has to follow your orders versus somebody that you need to influence and persuade, rather than direct.
Right.
We have a stall in leading change. There's been a great literature on that. One of our mentors, Jim O'Toole out of USC's business school, has written a lot on that, on leading change. But in that stall, we say that, you need to become the chief explaining officer and really practice those skills in order to lead change and communicate change on your audience's terms, not on your terms.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah. We talked about the stall and where you spend time and energy. And then finally, we have 2 stalls that are really interesting. One is a stall in your source of authority, which is where as you go through your career, people tend to follow you for different reasons than they used to. But if you're not aware of that, you'll lose authority, even though you're doing the same things that made you successful in the past. So that may be worth circling back to. And then finally, the granddaddy of all stalls, if you're in the leadership business, is stalling and failing to develop other leaders. Because at the end of the day, if you're trying to achieve through others, if you're not putting aside a healthy percentage of your own time to create those others, then you're really on a path of diminishing marginal returns in your own leadership energy.
For sure. Now, the one that you said you wanted to, by the way, when you were talking about the teamwork stall, you were talking about some ideas that if that one really struck anyone, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to episode number 60 so if you're watching, you saw me looking around, episode number 60 when I had Sam Walker on, who works for the Wall Street Journal. He wrote a great book about teams and using the sports and the research he did there. So I'd encourage you to go listen to episode 60 if that one particularly made a connection for you as you're listening. And you're nodding like, you know, Sam?
Yeah, no, but I know the book, and in fact, we talk about the 1994 U.S. Olympic basketball team in Greece that struggled to a bronze medal, but had LeBron James and Kobe Bryant and Carmelo Anthony on it as an example of all-star teams that aren't teams at all. Actually, they're just a bunch of highly talented individuals working kind of in the same room.
And so we come back to basketball. So there'll be a future episode where John and Kevin just talk about basketball and no one else will want to listen. So I would really like to dive into the authority stall. And yet I'm a little bit aware of our time and how much time we sort of tell people we're going to do. So can we give us just a couple of more minutes about the authority stall? Because that is the one.
Sure. So, early in your career as a leader, people tend to follow you for what you can do, your skills and capabilities, this stuff on your resume. In fact, I'm always amazed at when executive recruiters contact me or I'm chairing a comp committee on a board and we're hiring. People say, well, look at that resume. Like, yeah, the resume can get you the job, but we have an old expression. You get the job because of what you can do. If you lose the job, it's because of who you are. And so that tracks with your leadership career. People follow you early because of your technical expertise, your business acumen, your customer knowledge, all those things. If they're going to follow you later in your career, they're going to follow you because of your character, your judgment, your wisdom, which is different than smarts, and all these other qualities. And we tell a great story in there of how George Washington almost lost control of the Continental Army right before the crossing of the Delaware and the attack on Trenton on Christmas of 1776. Because he was really bad at his job. George Washington was like 0-6 at the time in the Revolutionary War. And he got challenged by this terrifically successful general who had technical mastery of the military craft for command of the army. And Washington, gave a little speech back saying why the men would follow him. And it turns out, even though he was bad at his job at the time, they would follow him because he had compassion and empathy and vision and character and good judgment and all these other things. So, Mark and I wrote about this recently about Mark Zuckerberg's challenge and Facebook's challenge in terms of his own leadership as they go through this period. People will follow Mark Zuckerberg and his leadership at Facebook more because of who he is and his ability to make big philosophical decisions rather than decisions about product management or technology or customer basis or any of that. So if leaders know that, if they know they need gravitas to continue their career, where's the gravitas store? How do they develop that? So we have a leadership development plan in the book for leaders to develop the kind of thing so people follow them for who they are rather than what they can do.
There you go, everybody. So we're going to shift to the next section of our program, which is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Leader, Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. And if that's you, and by the way, if you have one remote team member, you have a remote team, then you might want to check out longdistanceleaderbook.com. So now, going along with our basketball theme, John, we have what I call the fast break. I have 3 ideas for you.
Okay.
And I'm just going to give them to you and throw them out, and you can share whatever you want. The first one's easy because it's one of the words in the title of your book. The first one is reinvention.
Yeah.
So
well, gosh, this is the theme of the book. You said earlier it's about thinking. It is about thinking, but what we found, and the real aha for us in writing the book, was that CEOs think a lot, but they usually think about their organization and not themselves. And so for reinvention, we are really good as a community of leaders at reinventing organizations, but we're really lousy at reinventing ourselves. So if there's one takeaway from the book, it is don't necessarily work in your business, work on your business. And if you're going to work on your business, that means working on you. That's what you need to reinvent. Don't reorganize your company. Reorganize yourself.
There's your takeaway, everybody. If you need, so Lisa, the producer, will be looking for the quote, as there is in every episode in the show notes that we use in social media. That's probably it, Lisa. You just got it. So the next idea is leadership development.
Yeah, leadership development. The most important way you can spend your time, when Mark and I work with leaders, we'll often convince them of the need for them to spend 20 to 50% of the time. We tell a story of a great leader named Trevor Boyce in the book. There's about 35 original case studies in the book. One was Trevor Boyce. He ended up spending 50% of his time developing other leaders, to the point where he thought, that's the only business I'm in. I'm actually not in the business of medical testing. I'm in the business of developing other people. And we often find leaders get this in their head, but they don't get it on their calendars. They say, oh, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. And then it gets bumped by a meeting. It gets bumped by a crisis. It gets bumped by this. And so one of our tricks is we go back to the assistants and look at their calendars over the past 6 months and say, well, you said you were going to spend 20% of your time on leadership development. You only spent 3%. What's going on here? That's the key to a successful future for you and your enterprise. So leaders know it, but they don't do it, and they need to spend more time doing it. You don't need expertise. You need passion in order to be not just a boss, but also a coach and a mentor.
And the last word is vision.
Yeah, vision is tremendously important. The great leaders are also strategic. So they think deep and they think wide. They establish not only moral authority by getting on the high ground and asking not just the X's and O's questions, but what's the right thing to do for a company, but they establish strategic authority by getting on what I call the wide ground, which is where when everybody's focused on that tiny little issue in the meeting, they sit back and they say, well, in the big picture, ... and something follows. That's the leader's job. The leader fills in what follows. In the big picture and in the long run team, this is what the world looks like that we live in. These are the things shaping that world, and this is what we do. So leaders can develop this skill like any other skill. Some of them don't feel equipped to wrestle with vision, but they can and they need to, because it's one of the keys to authority as a leader.
And don't be scared of that word just
No.
because you might think it has a capital V, right?
Yeah,
so,
right.
so all this stuff, all the work that you've done, all the experiences you've had, the book that you've written, the work that you're doing with students and with leaders and organizations. So what do you do, John, for fun?
Oh gosh, well, I'm a master scuba diver. In fact, I just got back from a dive trip with a charity that I work with, where we get disabled teens scuba certified. So that was a lot of fun. And I ski, and I'm pretty active, and I've got 3 kids. I'm moving along through the system. So that there is a full-time job, just about. Dropped one off at college yesterday. See a lot going on. But I also, read a lot. Leaders need to read. I love the way on your podcast you promote this, and not just business books, but too many Fortune 500 CEOs don't read much outside of their balance sheet, and that bothers me. So I encourage leaders to read biographies. Mark and I have a big section in the book about reading fiction in order to understand human nature, because guess what? That's the business you're in as a leader.
All right, so that's the perfect lead into what do you want to what are you reading, or what do you want to recommend that other people read?
Well, gosh, I was very blessed. I've got some good friends that I've worked with in leadership capacities who helped blurb the book, and I'm on 2 of their books right now. So General Stan McChrystal wrote a very good book called Team of Teams, and he endorsed our book on the back cover. And I've served with General McChrystal twice over the course of career, and his book I think is really insightful about not just teamwork, but how teams of teams work together. It's a terrific book. And then Walter Isaacson, former president of the Aspen Institute, who also blurbed the book. His book, Da Vinci, is terrific. Now, Walter's written biographies on Ben Franklin, Steve Jobs, Leonardo da Vinci, and a couple of others. That kind of makes him the most interesting man in the world, writing about these 4 creative geniuses. And we're always on about innovation. We're always on about creativity. But the best way to learn about it is to walk in somebody's shoes for a while. And biographies are terrific ways. I recommend Walter's biography.
Yeah, and I tell you what, and that one, if you're not a all the time reader, you're going to look at Da Vinci. You better get it on Kindle, because you won't realize how thick it is. But the point is, it's worth it. It's worth diving in and sort of in letting yourself get enveloped in that, and taking yourself to a different time. And the lessons there are really, truly tremendous. So the last question for you, John, is where can we learn more about your work? Where can we learn more about you and Mark's book? And again, the book is called What Happens Now. Where can we learn more about it all?
Yeah, so the book website is whathappensnowbook.com. And you'll see a ton of things on there, a ton of material, videos, and all kinds of various things about the book, and also ways to get in touch with Mark and I for various things. We have very unusual backgrounds. Mark has a PhD in medieval literature from Harvard, but then became a Fortune 500 organizational development expert and executive coach. And I came to business via the military and some other different channels. And so, we've tried to approach this a different way. We put some different things up there that I hope people will be interested in.
And so again, whathappensnowbook.com. And so now my question for all of you listening or watching is now what are you going to do as a result of this? How are you going to take some of these ideas to start to reinvent yourself? How are you going to find your third space? Whatever it was that you heard us talking about that link caught for you, the challenge now is to go take some action. And guess what you got to do? You got to put it on the calendar. Good intentions not going to cut it. So hopefully you got more than just some ideas here, but you're going to go home and take some action on some of what you got from us today. So John, thanks so much for joining me. It was a total ball to have this conversation with you. I enjoyed it a great deal.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for your great work.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you too. Thanks for being here. And we're here every week, so you ought to be too, don't you think? Right here on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I'll see you next week.